there's sort of the issues, ethical issues regarding AI for society at large. And a lot of psychologists are interested in that and will be a part of that journey and that discussion. And then there are issues that come straight from our ethics code that are important for all psychologists to think about. Issues, confidentiality, informed consent, the importance of having a scientific basis for what you're doing.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today as we go beyond the couch and explore the world of AI in psychology. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde, a psychologist and AI strategist, and I want to welcome you to Beyond the Couch, AI in Psychology. Okay, so before we get started, I always want to take a second to thank our sponsors, without whom this show would not be possible. So the American Board of Professional Psychology, also known as ABAP, the National Register of Health Service Psychologists, and Wayde AI, which is my AI consulting company. Okay, so if you know me at all, you know that I love AI and I love working in this area. However, the psychologist in me who was trained to respect and appreciate ethics sometimes feels more than a little uncomfortable not knowing exactly how ethics, specifically ethics applied in the field of psychology and the frontier field of AI, which is what it really is, are meant to integrate and complement each other. So that's why I'm really very excited to have our guest today, Dr. Lindsay Childress Beatty. I say that right?
Beatty.
Beatty, thank you. Lindsay Childress Beatty, who is Chief of Ethics at the American Psychological Association, commonly called APA. Dr. Childress Beatty is actually APA's first Chief of Ethics, and she has a PhD in clinical psychology and is a licensed lawyer. So with over 20 years of ethics work at APA, Lindsay sometimes regularly speaks and presents at both psychology and technology conferences. Dr. Childress Beatty, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ernest.
So I'm very excited to talk to you about ethics and AI. But first, I would love to hear a little bit about your background. I'm just fascinated by your broad expertise in law, psychology, and ethics, and now AI. So tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got involved in all of this.
Well, I think it's like a lot of people, I kind of go where I find something that's really interesting and stimulating to study. I think that's probably pretty common for psychologists. So I was a lawyer for about 5.5 years, large law firm, but was very interested in psychology, and actually originally thought I'd be a clinical psychologist treating lawyers. But you know how life goes on and you move, things sort of segue in different directions. So
Yeah.
After I got the PhD in clinical, I had the opportunity to come to APA as its deputy general counsel. And I thought that was too good of an opportunity to pass up. So that's what I did. And one of my areas while I was deputy general counsel was ethics. So that's how I got interested in ethics. And more, it seemed like ethics was going to be the great mix that could use some of my psychology background, also the law background, because we do adjudication, which has a big legal piece to it. And it just was an area that there was always something new to be, studying, considering, thinking about. So it just attracted me more. So I switched over to the ethics office, and I've been there many, many years.
That's such an awesome set of experiences. I love the way that you're able to integrate the law and the ethics in helping psychologists. I think that's really awesome.
Yeah,
Okay, so
great.
So there's a lot to cover, and I just want to ask you, first of all, what are you seeing as the most important and or concerning things as it comes to ethics and AI in the field of psychology? What should we be paying attention to?
So I think I like to think of it in sort of on two levels. There's sort of the issues, ethical issues regarding AI for society at large. And a lot of psychologists are interested in that and will be a part of that journey and that discussion. And then there are issues that come straight from our ethics code that are important for all psychologists to think about. Issues, confidentiality, informed consent, the importance of having a scientific basis for what you're doing. I think it's critical on both for society and for psychology to keep that human in the loop. So this is a partner. It's not someone that you just defer to. So those are some of the big issues.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there, especially the keeping the human in the loop. I think, especially as we're talking about AI and especially as it's really in its infancy in terms of what it can do, I think keeping that human in the loop is really very important. What about when we're talking about, especially from the point of mental health, and we have a certain set of ethics and principles that we are trained in? How do we apply that or try to apply that to this new onslaught of AI applications and tools that are pouring into the market, especially as clients are also using them and things like
Yes, so I think the code, although we're in the process of revising our code, and I think the new code will have more mention of artificial intelligence and other technologies than the current code does. I think you can still use the current code, and a lot of the same standards and principles can be used to kind of navigate these issues. And in a way, they're not, some of them are not different than when we were first, which seems like it was a long time ago, but wasn't that long ago, integrating telepsychology into psychologist work.
that. Hmm.
So you're still thinking about all those same issues. One of the big ones I think with AI is competence, because you can't, just as an example, you can't give informed consent on the AI you're using if you don't have enough understanding of it to be able to explain it to the patient. And also if you don't understand, for example, where the data are going, is this a
Hmm.
closed system that's protected, or obviously as a psychologist you would not be using an open AI to write uh, clinical notes, for example. So some of the same issues. So I think sometimes you can also think by analogy. Is this different than other technologies we've used? And sometimes the answer is yes, and then you got to think it through more. Sometimes the answer is no, it's really kind of the same.
Yeah, I love that underlying need for competence in terms of psychologists being able to understand the AI applications that we're using, right? I remember when I was trained in a lot of different assessment tools, you didn't just use the tools, you really had to understand it and understand how it worked and how the validation behind it. And I love that we're thinking about AI and AI applications sort of in that way as well.
See, that's a great example also of what I meant by analogy. Thinking, kind of using it in the same way to think about, okay, what do I need to know to be competent in this? The thing that's trickier with AI, of course, is that we don't always know what is the underlying algorithm. Sometimes it's the people talk about it being a black box. And so you need to be also picking the right AI tools and then really having that understanding of them and being mindful that you do need to have that understanding. You can't just rely on the AI.
Yeah, I think so. This brings up a really good point. And when I talk about AI, I talk about the balance between trust to some degree, but also understanding that there's a risk because we don't know what's going on in the black box, right? And even some of the developers aren't able to always explain why the AI applications are making certain decisions or going in certain directions. So, as a psychologist, where I've been trained that I need to understand everything and understand how everything works, how do we balance that? In terms of that trust, but also that risk that's associated with some of these black boxes that are out
I think that's a great thing to think about. um, I think when you're looking at, for example, using it in your practice or recommending it to a patient, that's a higher standard than when you can use Chat GPT to create a treatment plan, as
there.
long
Hmm.
as it's not about a specific patient with any, you're not adding any data into it. So it's kind of, and we all use spell check and other things, and more AI is going to be a part of what we do just generally. So you're also looking at sort of what's the risk for, how am I using it, and then is what's the risk at that level of use, and how much do I need to understand to be able to help my patients with it. um, I think it's really, I'm not an expert on this at all, but I think automation bias is so interesting because when we talk about human in the loop, the answer is, well, we just have the human as a second. The AI is going to spit out something, and then we're going to review it and say yes or no to it. And I really think we need to be looking at, yes, but there's automation bias, and what are the factors, both person factors, context factors, way you set up the AI, so that people don't just defer to the technology. So we think there's going to be a human in the loop, but is that actually going to happen, or is there going to be a deference to technology? So I think that's a really interesting question that society has to grapple with.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point because when I talk about AI, one of the things that I think is really important is that we need to understand that the AIs, especially nowadays, are still fallible. They make mistakes, they can have errors. So you're not just double checking. It's also important that you think critically about what you've asked the AI to do, reviewing the output and making sure that it is absolutely correct because they do make mistakes. I'm wondering, what do you see in terms of the future for psychologists, especially as we have this human in the mix? How are psychologists able to play a significant part in the development of AI going forward?
So I think they can make, really make a critical difference. I think both in highlighting the ethical issues and
Hmm.
being a part of, design teams so that they're looking at the human side of how the technology works. Often design teams are software engineers, and you need that psychologist to be a part of that mix to bring that in. So I think that's important. I also think the research is going to be very important. Things like automation bias. Another one is the whole concept in education of how do you maintain critical thinking skills? How do you make sure you're not de-skilling workers? What do you do about the pipeline issues? Those are all issues that psychologists can research and really provide good data on. So I think that's, we can also help from that perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about psychology is that the way in which we're trained allows us to be experts in research and ethics and all of these things that can be really helpful to the development of AI and AI applications, especially as it relates to mental health, which is one of our areas of expertise. Now, I know that the APA recently put out some guidelines to help in terms of psychologists and health service psychology. Can you tell us a little bit about those guidelines and kind of how we're supposed to be using those?
Yes, so it's ethical guidance for health service psychologists on the use of AI in professional practice. And I think they're wonderful because there are a lot of practical tips. They're grounded in our ethical principles, in our ethics code. And you'll see those principles mentioned and tied to the advice, but then they're giving practical advice on what you can do. So it's a great combination of the ethics underpinning and the practical advice.
Yeah, I love the combination of the ethical principles and that we're familiar with, combined with that ethical and practical advice of what you can actually do in the setting. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting when it comes to ethics and AI is, when we're talking about AI, especially right now, it's a continually evolving frontier. What applies or what works today will be different tomorrow, and it's moving so rapidly and changing so quickly. How do we give a set of ethical principles or guidelines that can help, regardless of the changes that are going on? How do we manage and adjust as things are changing so quickly?
I think it's difficult, but I think it's possible. And I think, you go back to those basic issues: competence, informed consent, transparency, so that you're allowing patient autonomy or client autonomy. All those fairness and equity and justice. That's another big issue, is the bias that is inherent in some of the programming. Um, and this human in the loop, which I tie to our scientific basis, that anything a psychologist does, the ethics code requires that there be a scientific or professional basis for it. And so that's where I kind of tie human in the loop. So all these issues, you can use the current code and really think them through from this new lens. And that's what makes ethics exciting. It's not a one and done. It's a really nuanced evaluation that you continually engage in.
Yeah, I love that framework, right? It's continually adjusting and it's the process, not just the end, right?
Right, exactly.
So tell us a little bit about how you use AI in your work. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, so we've used it to look at, large sets of information. Like, for example, we just finished a public comment on the new draft of the code. So in addition to actually reading, there were over 2,600, comments, individual comments on various provisions of the draft. In addition to going through all of those, the slow old method in an Excel spreadsheet, we also used AI in asking multiple different prompts to get ideas, themes that were coming up, to sort of summarize things that then helped us to look more critically at sort of our old Excel spreadsheet. So that was one example. I've also used it to create, just sort of what everyone else is doing as well, like the first draft of a proposal for a conference. And that was, it's fascinating how you can, over iterations, you get better and better in getting what you want, because you get the first output and you're like, this isn't exactly, I'm missing this and this. And then and I think we're all learning that's another competence, to be able to do a prompt that really is excellent and gets you what you want or what you need. So things like issues like that, I'm using it for, just as everyone else is, sort of the day-to-day administrative stuff.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this focus on competency, and I think one of the things that as psychologists or individuals really who want to use these AI applications appropriately, ethically and responsibly, it's not just about understanding what that means ethically, but also understanding about the prompts, right? How do you ask the questions, or the right questions in the right ways to get the right responses from these AI applications and tools? And so what are we thinking in terms of how do we educate future psychologists, not just the current psychologists, but how do we change and adapt our education for future psychologists to help them be better prepared for this new world?
So I think we definitely need to do that. And I think teaching prompting is part of it. I also think we've got to make sure that we keep that critical thinking skill. And how do we do that? And how do we make sure that they continue to have the core skills we need, and not so that we're not in a situation of de-skilling. But the interesting thing about that is I think we also have to be open-minded about what are the core skills. So for example, in the writing process, and I'm sure there's research on this, and I'm not an expert on education of writing, but maybe we end up more of an editor than previous generations who had to start with a blank page. And maybe that's a different set of skills that we need to learn, or maybe not. But thinking things that through, and that's where educational psychology research could really be helpful. So I find when I ask it to write something for me, I get a draft back, and I'm like, oh, this is so eloquent and it's so beautifully written. And then when I sit with a little bit, I'm like, but it's really not saying anything, or it's really not getting at the core of what I was trying to say in this sentence. And that's the critical thinking skill. I think it's also interesting, it kind of reminds me of, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but, you'll read often that there is some value in writing notes out longhand, that there is some interaction that actually imprints it on the brain in a better way than if you're typing it. And I'm wondering, so what is the effect of using AI in classrooms, for example? And so psychological research will be able to answer that, and that's exciting. It's not ethics, but it's exciting.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity here if you think about it in terms of you're talking about critical thinking and how do we maintain that critical thinking, right? So from an ethics perspective, how do we make sure that future psychologists continue to understand ethically what are the pillars that they need to attend to when they can just ask AI, right? How do we make sure that they are integrating that into their thinking, into their approach, instead of just deferring to AI and believing what it says without, if they don't have that critical knowledge and that critical ability, they'll just take its word for it. But I have found many times when I challenge the AI application, it'll say, oh, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong about this, and it'll rethink, right? And so from an ethics point of view, how can we do that? How can we make sure that future psychologists are continuing to think critically about the use of AI?
So I think it's also teaching ethical frameworks and how to think ethically in the first place, because ethics is very much nuanced and it's very much context dependent. And you really have to sort of, if you've got an issue, if you've got a dilemma, you've got to think it through on multiple levels. And sort of look at it as if it's a diamond, and you got to look at all the different facets of the issue and then put it all together for a correct answer. So it's very nuanced. And of course, we live in a world that's much more about soundbite and can you make it snappy and quick? And that's really not ethical thinking. So I think if we teach ethical thinking, that will also help with the critical thinking needed for AI. But I don't think we should not teach AI, because I think the jobs of the future are going to have that as a part of, it's going to be woven into jobs.
Yeah.
So it's important.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it's
anti-AI.
Yeah. No, I think it's the combination of yes and, right. How do we approach that ethical thinking in an AI world, right? So ethics using AI, ethics embracing AI, ethics, having to deal with others who are using AI and are trying to navigate ethical dilemmas. I think it's really important, as you're saying, that psychologists continue to build that competency, not just in ethics, but ethics specifically in that AI setting.
Yeah. This also brings up the pipeline issue and the issue of, are students going to be learning what they need? And also, are there going to be the entry jobs that provide the basis for further growth? If some of those entry jobs are taken over by AI, then how do we build this pipeline, and how do we move people forward so that they have those skills, those critical thinking skills, to be the senior researcher, for example? So I think that's another ethical issue.
Yeah, and one of the ones that I hear a lot about is, the fear and the concern that AI is going to take mental health jobs, right? In terms of just from the point of therapists to research, all of these things. Ethically speaking, from the ethical perspective, how do we navigate that? How do we address that? Because I think for the most part, that's not accurate, right? But there are some jobs, as you said, which AI can do better than people, and so some of those jobs will be taken up. How do we approach that? How do we think about that from an ethical perspective?
So I think the first part of it is having an awareness of it, that this is a possible harm, and how do we navigate that harm? I think that's an important piece of it. I think some of it will be that jobs shift rather than disappear. And, but we have to be really thinking about what's the impact on society, and looking at it from that lens as well as from the psychology lens. And when you're talking about mental health, and AI, you're also looking at, I would go back to almost a bioethics risk benefit analysis. So, for example, people talk about maybe there's a certain app, and it's digital therapeutic app. Well, you got to balance, how is it helping people? How is it reaching people that otherwise wouldn't be reached? But what is the right population for that app? And you want to be able to augment the work that psychologists can do. But that won't replace psychologists, because they're going to be patients and areas and needs where you need the person, where you need the psychologist. And then, of course, the psychologist needs to be involved in the building of the app in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think both of those, you're looking at both sides of it.
Yeah. And I think, as you've said, if we take it out more globally and look at it from the social aspect in terms of AI and its impact on society as a whole, there's questions, ethically speaking, in terms of energy use. AI uses up a lot of energy, and all the pros and cons of that, all the way up to global mental health and global health, and how AI benefits those are the haves versus the have-nots. And there's a lot going on there. What are some of the big global issues and social issues that you're thinking of from an ethical?
Yeah, so you've named a couple of them. The sustainability issue, the I would call it environmental stewardship issue. The fact that it's right now mainly a Western issue, and of course a lot of the data, it's sort of reflecting back on us, our world. So a lot of the data is Western, or the old days we talked about the weird data, and how do we broaden that out? What do we do about the bias in some of the data? How do we fix those issues? There are harm issues, trying to think through the ways in which it could support fairness and equity versus the ways in which it can actually make things less equitable. And I'm interested on both sides. I mean, I think, you can talk, for example, about a non-native English speaker can run a paper that they've written through AI, and it can just clean up the English a little bit better, which will give them a better chance to be published in an English journal. That can be a positive. So there's ways in which, or, people talk about needing less background in coding languages than it used to be. So barriers to entry can be lower to certain jobs. So those are some of the positive sides where it could actually foster equity. So you kind of got to look at both of it and just, but be mindful of these issues and try and figure out ways to minimize them.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is just as you talked about no code AI, where you don't have to be as technically have the technical expertise as you would before in terms of creating these things. Now there's lots of opportunities to create your own AI agent without having a lot of knowledge or expertise in terms of technical expertise. On the other hand, I think then there's the other question of cultural competency, right? Because if we're creating all these things and they work in the Western world, and how does that apply to other cultures, people who see things differently, who approach things differently, And so I think this is an area where psychologists who are trained in cultural competency can actually be very helpful in highlighting the importance of making sure that you're being aware of the culture and the environment in which you're trying to offer the tools.
Totally agree. And wouldn't it be great if the developers had a culturally competent psychologist working with them on those issues?
Yeah, I mean,
perfect addition.
I think I always say if there's work being done in AI and it relates to humans, or you expect humans to use it, there should be a psychologist involved because we are experts in human behavior. So I'm a big proponent of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Great point.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. There's so much more we could talk about, but I want to be respectful of your time. I want to ask, how do people contact you if they want to continue the conversation, if they want to reach out to you? What's a good way?
So we have a contact the ethics office button, and it's several places on our website. You can find our web pages for ethics at www.apa.org/ethics. And you'll see the button there. You can also look around. We've got a bunch of great FAQs from the ethics committee and several webinars on AI that we've done recently on ethics and AI. You can watch those videos. So, but that's the best way to get a hold of me, through that contact the ethics office.
Awesome. Are you seeing a lot of requests that are coming up about AI and ethics?
Not in our consultation service yet, but we've done several webinars, and there have been, really strong interest in the webinars. A lot of people they know it's an issue. They know it's coming down the pike. They may not be using it a lot, but they're really searching for ways to start to think about it. So those are very, very popular. I think in the future, we will be getting those questions through our consultation service, but we haven't too much yet. I also want to mention, if anybody's going to APA 2025, we're going to have a main stage. The ethics committee is having a main stage program on clinical use of AI in clinical training, which I think is going to be fantastic for those who do that work. So I'm excited about it. We have several main stage and several other programs. I'm excited about all our programs, but that is going to be a particularly exciting one for AI.
Awesome. Well, before I let you go, I always want to take advantage of the experts we have on the show. What's a tip or a suggestion or recommendation that you have for clinicians out there that are trying to prepare for AI?
I think just getting that basic competence, understanding a little bit about AI, and then being certain about what you're using with patients, understanding that at a really high level. But I don't think you should be nervous about that, because I think you've done this before. You've done it with telepsychology, you've done it with other issues, but competence, I think, is a pretty strong one.
Yeah. I love that the reminding people that we've been trained for this to some degree. We do understand how to deal with new things. So just continue to build that competence. I think is really important.
Absolutely. You said it very well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fantastic to have you. I hope we can have you back and talk a little bit more about ethics in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Awesome. Well, if you have enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. Feedback is a gift, and we love gifts. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we hope to see you again soon.